Député de Jonquière.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister made some false comments in her remarks. Checks that are delivered are being received on time. We're talking about a rotating strike, not a full strike. And it is the work of the postal workers to deliver the strikes on time, the paychecks, because they're important. That's why they opted for a rotating strike. I'd like to invite the Minister to go outside, to put her toucan in her coat, and to see the workers on the work floor, to go and look at how much goodwill there is to deliver the mail, Mr. Speaker. Why is the Minister only defending Canada Post's version and talking about Amazon and eBay, when in fact mail is being delivered on time because it's a rotating strike?
Et de travail.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable colleague for her question. Of course, we know that this strike is affecting Canada Post workers as well. It's a hardship for the workers. It's a hardship for the small businesses that rely on the service. It's a hardship for the individuals who rely on a variety of different kinds of mail and checks to get through their everyday lives and deal with their financial affairs. And so that's why we have worked so diligently on supporting these parties to get a deal. As I said, we don't take this lightly. We are not going to be debating the legislation today. We still believe that a deal is possible, and we encourage both parties to work together to find that deal so they can bring an end to this labour disruption and ensure that people get the mail, the essential mail that they need. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Minister for her presentation today, but I do find it a little bit ironic that when we were, the Conservatives were in government in 2011, we brought forward back-to-work legislation on Canada Post, and the Liberals were very critical, extremely critical of that move. And the Minister has said today that the situation is a crisis with many of our small business owners. She mentioned some directly and specifically that our small businesses, as we go through Black Friday and Christmas and Cyber Monday, they need a dependable postal service to ensure that they can be successful. And I think the Minister even mentioned that some businesses are in jeopardy of even being able to stay in business and may close their doors if Canada Post has not gone back to work. So my question to the Minister, if this situation is such a crisis and our small businesses across the country are depending on a Canada Post up and running, why is she not being more forceful and acting on this more quickly and instead just talking about it today?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Employment.
Opportunity to highlight the contrast between our government and the previous Harper Conservative government, who did not believe in fair and balanced labour relations, who whipped in legislation as quickly as possible, not only to end labour disruptions but to prevent them, who interfered in the collective bargaining process by introducing harmful legislation that we repealed with Bill C-4. That is why we've waited, Mr. Speaker, because we want to make sure that we are doing everything possible to support the collective bargaining process to help these parties find a deal. We know that a deal that's arrived on by both parties working together is the strongest deal for Canada. We're going to continue the work that we do to build up the labour movement, to support the labour movement, and to take action when absolutely necessary. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Regina Leuven.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The last time the Government of Canada ordered Canada Post employees back to work, the courts ruled that legislation to be unconstitutional. One of the ways we normally try to make sure that legislation is constitutional is by having a full debate on it in this House and also by having a full study of it at committee. So I'd like to ask the Minister why she is putting forward a motion to limit consideration of this potential legislation to only a couple of hours, and how is she so confident that it's going to be constitutional this time?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said before, I am putting forward a motion today, which does not necessarily mean we will be debating the legislation. I am hopeful that the parties will reach an agreement, and we encourage them to stay at the table and get that deal. Having said that, we know that Canadians are expecting us to act quickly. As I mentioned in my speech, Canadians are struggling, whether it's individuals who are waiting for payments of a variety of different kinds, whether it's small businesses that are on the cusp of potentially going out of business, whether it's other businesses that rely on this time of year for their most profitable time. And so we will take action as the Government of Canada to ensure that all Canadians' needs are met. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Some comments. The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Much, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say, I am a little surprised at the gall of the minister to stand up in this place and say that she's still hopeful that the two sides are going to come to a deal, when 2 weeks ago the government signaled publicly, and we don't know when they signaled to Canada Post privately, but certainly publicly 2 weeks ago, they were saying that they were prepared to introduce back-to-work legislation. That's what considering all options means, Mr. Speaker, and nobody was fooled into thinking otherwise. So when the minister herself is signaling that they're prepared to legislate workers back to work, she has to know, if she has any decency as the Minister of Labour or appropriateness for the position, that that undermines the possibility of a fair deal coming out at the bargaining table, because the company knows that the workers are going to be legislated back to work. So how dare she get up at this place and say that she's hopeful they're going to reach a deal when she's been threatening for weeks to legislate those workers back to work and taking their leverage away at the bargaining table?
Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, it's my job as Minister of Labour to make sure that we have fair and balanced labour relations in this country, and also to make sure that we take action when we know that Canadians and the Canadian economy need that action to be taken. In fact, legislation is a tool that the Minister of Labour has in the case that a negotiated agreement can't be arrived upon. And we know that these parties are still at the table, that they are still negotiating, and so, as I said, I expect them to stay there. We have discretion about when we will debate this legislation, and I will be monitoring it very closely. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a difficult decision for the minister to put this forward, but I know full well that the effort, the time, the energy that her and her whole team have put into trying to find a way forward on this particular issue. But I'd like her to contrast once again, as the Conservatives had said, we were very critical when they came forward with back-to-work legislation, and we know that they had record use of back-to-work legislation while they were in government. You know, they had pieces of legislation on the shelf, and once a strike had been called, they pulled that down, insert name here, and the back-to-work legislation was put forward. As a matter of fact, on the Canada Post, when they legislated Canada Post back, they legislated the workers back for less of a wage than Canada Post had actually offered during negotiations. Shame. Mr. Speaker, I'd like the minister to again share with the House how the actions undertaken by this government have certainly stand in stark contrast to what has taken place before under the Conservatives.
The Honourable Minister of Employment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question, and my colleague is right to highlight that this is a dramatically different approach than the previous government. The previous government, as my colleague pointed out, did not allow for labour disruption. In fact, sometimes preempted strike action by introducing back-to-work legislation in a way that was extremely harmful to the labour movement, extremely harmful to workers across this country. As you noted in my remarks, we have taken every effort over a long period of time to assist these parties to come to a negotiated agreement. As a matter of fact, the parties are still working together today, and I thank them for that, and I encourage them to stay at the table and get a negotiated agreement. Mr. Speaker, we have worked hard to ensure that the labour movement has the protections that they need. We have listened to the labour movement. We have introduced modern labour standards. We have introduced pay equity, and we have actually passed legislation that strengthens the rights of workers and protects workers in Canadian workplaces. Thank you.
I got time for one more short question and response. The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You know, I'm listening to this debate, and if there ever is a lesson about talking out of both sides of your mouth, this is the moment. But I shouldn't be surprised, because the minister learns that from the Prime Minister. We see it all the time. Does the minister not understand the very fact that she's speaking here today, signaling that the government would be prepared to bring back-to-work legislation for the postal workers, that she stacked the deck, and that it will skew the entire negotiation process for the corporation against the workers? How can she get up here and claim that this will allow for a fair negotiation process for both parties?
Well, Minister of Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very confident that we have used every tool in our toolbox to get a negotiated agreement, and I am still hopeful that they will arrive at that agreement. As a matter of fact, the parties are working together today. I encourage them to work diligently to find that agreement. Having said that, as the Government of Canada, we have a responsibility to all Canadians, and we will take that responsibility seriously. We have small businesses that are suffering. We have rural and remote communities that are suffering. We have individuals that are concerned about how they're going to make rent next month. We have calls to act, and that is in fact what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Resuming debate.